Welcome to Wild Places. I'm your host, Brad Clement. This podcast is presented by Panji Foundation, saving snow leopards, helping communities. Michael Kodas, huge thanks for joining us today on the Wild Places podcast. Just fun to have you here. Do you remember the first time we met?
I have a vision of the first time we met, but I've also learned that sometimes those visions aren't quite accurate. And somebody tells me, "No, it was when you stole money from me. You beat me up and took my lunch money." But no, I remember meeting you in a restaurant in Kathmandu before we were all headed into the Himalayas.
So it was 2006, Mike's Breakfast in Kathmandu.
There we go. Yeah.
And your wife joined us. And at the time, Tanya, who was a teammate of mine for our expedition, who has now become my wife, we all joined together at Mike's Breakfast. And you were doing some research for your book, High Crimes. That's how I first met you. That's how I knew you. You were a climber, you were a mountaineer, and you were writing this book. Fast forward to today, many years later. At that time, neither one of us lived in Boulder, Colorado. Now we both do. We are literally, as we sit here on this online interview process, we're actually about a mile apart from each other.
Yeah.
That's it. Our homes are so close, and it's been fun since 2006. We've just developed this fun friendship. I never really knew what a badass you were in terms of writing, in terms of journalism. You are a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. For many years, you served as the deputy director of the Environmental School of Journalism at the University of Colorado. And now you're a senior editor at Inside Climate News. Is that correct?
I'm the senior editor, which is an interesting title because there are three editors and I am the least senior of the three, but somehow my title turned into senior editor.
Good enough.
Yeah, it works.
Yeah. So this whole time I knew you wrote books, our whole friendship. I knew you wrote this book, Megafire. And I have to tell you, I never paid that much attention to the book until this past summer of 2020, where Colorado, where we both live and call home now, had, was it three of the four largest fires in the history of the state in one summer?
It had its three largest fires in history this last summer. And it would be four if you counted a fourth fire that largely burned in Wyoming, but also burned into Colorado and burned a lot of terrain in this state as well.
So this whole time, I know that you wrote this book and I hadn't read it. So this summer, I picked it up. I couldn't put it down. It was fantastic. And I've relayed this to you before. And of course, then sent copies to my parents, sent copies to friends. It was a fantastic, if not horrible, journey of human interaction with wildfires and where the future may go. What originally got you fascinated with wildfires?
So there's a story that I tell in the book that you might recall of the first time I saw a wildfire, which was on the East Coast in a place where, we don't really think of having a lot of bad fires, in Connecticut, and just heard a scanner call for a grass fire. And, I was a young photojournalist and raced out there and hopped a couple of fences to get to where I could see a group of guys digging a fire line around this grass fire, and, raised up my camera to make a photograph of them doing their work, and immediately heard screaming before I ever even took a picture. And looked up, and there's this guy about the size of a bulldozer, and he is running at me, and he's wearing a badge. And I thought, boy, this cannot be good. And it turns out that in trying to get close to the action of this fire, I had strayed onto the grounds of a prison in Connecticut. The fences I'd hopped had been kind of the distant perimeter fences of this prison's grounds, and all of the firefighters I was trying to photograph were inmates. And this guard proceeded to tackle me and start dragging me out, and in language less polite than I can use here, explain that this is a prison, dude, and they can't just walk out, and you can't just walk in. And as he was dragging me out, the weather turned, the wind turned, and got behind the flames, and the fire blew up and was just about to overrun one of these inmate firefighters. And he started running away and happened to be running straight at me. And I was trying to make a photograph of this guy with a telephoto lens, while a guy who's trained to restrain violent felons is dragging me away. And I can tell you that's pretty much not possible, particularly when you're like 170-pound, little wisp of a journalist, and you're dealing with a very big and well-trained prison guard. And then the guy saw what I was trying to do, and I figured, oh, well, now I'm doomed. I'm probably not going to get to leave prison. He's going to handcuff me and keep me here, or he's going to take my cameras, or at least throw his hand in front of the lens. And instead, he kind of picked me up by my armpits and pushed me towards the action. And I was able to motor drive a sequence of photos of this prison inmate running for his life from this wildfire blowing up. And then the wind died down and the flames died down, and the prisoner was not killed. And he went back to work, and the guard went back to work too, and knocked me back down and started cursing at me again, and dragged me to the fence that I'd hopped over to get in there, and said, so long, and that's how I got thrown out of prison. But I also, got really interested in the idea that, wow, these wildland firefighters were prison inmates. And so I did some research into that and discovered that out here in the West, here in Colorado, and particularly in California, there are thousands of prison inmates that fight wildfires, largely outside the grounds of their prisons. And in fact, in a really bad fire like we just had in California, up to 60-70% of the personnel in a wildfire can be prison inmates. That are brought in from their prisons. They get paid like $1 or $2 a day, but it's a way for them to work in the woods and be outside the prison. And in fact, in California, there's a big push now, and they finally passed a bill that will allow these inmates to work as wildland firefighters after they're released from prison, because that was one of the great ironies of this, I discovered, was that they could be wildland firefighters while they were in prison, but their felony convictions would prevent them from getting jobs as wildland firefighters, even though they were trained once they were released. And that just really got me interested in this issue of wildfires. And basically, I eventually trained and worked a summer as a wildland firefighter, because I saw that, boy, they're so desperate for firefighters out west, because the fires are growing so much larger and so quickly that, they're taking, military personnel, they're taking people from state agencies, they're taking prison inmates. For God's sakes, if they're taking prison inmates, there's probably an opportunity for me too.
How did that work? How do you sign up to go under wildland fire training?
So you get connected with a unit. In my case, I discovered that there were a bunch of employees at the Connecticut Department of Environmental Protection, where I was working as a journalist, who were not going to be available to talk to me for a story I was working on in the summer. I was covering fisheries. And I said, so, what's going on? And they go, well, we sign up and make ourselves available for the federal call-up to go fight fires out west. And, as a journalist, that was really interesting to me, because how did that work, that you are state employees and the taxpayers in Connecticut pay your salary, but you're going to go out and fight fire in a different state? What do the taxpayers in Connecticut think about, paying to train these guys? And, as it turned out, they didn't pay their salary when they were actually out fighting the fires. The federal government took that on. But nonetheless, that state was losing personnel and paying to train them so that they could work for a different state. In our case, I trained up with these guys, and we worked in Colorado and Wyoming on wildfires over the summer. So that became another look behind the scenes. And there was one particular instance in that season that I worked on fire, where we were on a fire that was, very remote here in Colorado, didn't really threaten anything, a few cabins. And there was a lot of personnel at it, a lot of helicopters, just a lot of resource being thrown at it. And I kept, I would always identify myself as both a firefighter and a journalist to the incident command, and went to the incident commander a couple of times and said, hey, everybody's kind of wondering why we're fighting this fire. It really seems like one that's, remote enough where we'd better off. Hang on a second. We can back that up if you want. Sorry, I didn't. I figured this cut me off, but it didn't.
It's the way of the modern world. Way of the modern world.
I got so many electronics around me. So anyway, eventually this incident commander came to me and said, "Well, I've got a story for you. The Secret Service just called me and told me I have to ground my helicopters, and I won't do it. And it's not that I feel we need to fight this fire with helicopters, but if you or one of your colleagues gets injured back fighting this fire, I need to be able to medevac you. And if I have to ground my helicopters, I can't pull you out if you get injured, and I'm not going to agree to that." And of course, my question was, why would the Secret Service care about this little fire back here in Colorado? And the incident commander said, well, I'll finally tell you why we're fighting this fire. Dick Cheney has a fishing trip planned here next week. And we've been ordered to clear all the flames and smoke from the woods so that the vice president can have a nice fishing trip. And that was just one of any number of lessons from my time at the prison and from my time working as a wildland firefighter, where I realized that the smoke and the flames are really dramatic. The nature of fire on our landscape is very dramatic. It makes for really dramatic pictures and great stories. But most of the power of this phenomenon and its influence on our society is happening behind those flames and that smoke. It's politics, it's economics, it's decisions that we've made as a society or as a culture, and how we're going to relate to fire, how we're going to fight fire, how we're going to manage fire, who has to do it, who has their resources threatened and who doesn't. And that's where I really got interested in wildfire.
So why does Colorado, for example, you could say California, you could say Australia, any number of places around the world, why did Colorado see such a massive outbreak this summer? And I think of the one fire, it was at East Troublesome, in a single, I think, 20-hour period, spread over 100,000 acres in size. To me, that just seems unreal. How fast do these fires go? And why is it happening more and more often?
So, yeah, that's a really good question. And, we're still behind California as far as the severity of our wildfires go and the amount of land that's burned. But we're kind of cutting edge here in Colorado because we're in a transitional phase. And I think that's what we saw this last summer. The fire that you mentioned, the East Troublesome fire, one interesting way to look at that is that in a 36-hour period this last summer, it burned more land than the fire that held the record as the largest fire in Colorado history prior to last year burned in 2 months. So that's a huge change. And the fact that we had our three largest fires in history in Colorado, all burning basically simultaneously, is a huge challenge for land managers, for communities, and particularly for the people who were trying to deal with these fires. And that was all built on top of how COVID affected our firefighting effort, because we had lots of firefighters who were out with COVID or who were quarantined. And in fact, in California, most of their inmate firefighters that they are so dependent on actually got quarantined because their prisons got so full of COVID. So these become really complicated resource management issues. As for why it's happening, I kind of break it into 4 overarching themes. And one is, even though it's not true in the way that we heard it so much in the last couple of years about California, forest management is a big issue in our wildfire situation. And here in the United States, that's most obvious in what we did to our forests by putting out every natural wildfire that we could over the period of basically a century. We had for about 50 years what we called an out by 10 a.m. policy, which was basically a zero tolerance policy for natural wildfire. And in a lot of our forests, particularly like the ponderosa pine forest that you and I look out our windows at here, they are adapted to very frequent low intensity fire. So some of our ponderosa pine forests here on the Front Range in Colorado have been documented to burn as often as every 2 years. It's very common for them to burn every 10 years. So if you take a forest that's adapted to burn every 10 years, and these low intensity fires on the ground would go through and kill small trees and remove competing species and burn away a lot of grasses and just remove a huge amount of fuel for wildfires. And if you put out every fire for a century in that landscape, it's not difficult math to figure out you're going to have at least 10 times that amount of vegetation. And in some of our forests that we fought all these fires in, like in New Mexico and Arizona, they've documented 30 or 40 times the amount of fuel in these forests after we put out every fire for so long. So yeah, we do have in some forest types, other forest types, it doesn't make a difference. A lodgepole pine forest burns every 200 or 300 years. So putting out every fire for a century isn't going to affect how much fuel's in there like it would with a lot of forests that are used to much more frequent fire. But many forests are really overgrown and have a lot of fuel in them. And so that's definitely, one of the drivers. It's not, necessarily the biggest, but it's a significant one. The next driver, and this deals with where I work now at Inside Climate News, is climate change. And wildfire around the world is probably one of the places where we see the impacts of climate change most clearly. And that was one of the reasons that I wanted to do this book. Sea level rise is really serious and probably will cost society a lot more than the increase in wildfires, but it's very slow. Comes on over decades, and it's just a gradual increase of a ½ inch a year or something. So, people don't really notice it, whereas fire is extremely dramatic and presents you with imminent mortal threat. People pay attention to it, and you notice the changes with it, even smaller ones. And what we're seeing is not small. One way that you can see the way climate change has affected wildfire is actually something that we can see now, which is snowpack. When you see a snowy peak above a big green forest, that snowy peak is effectively a trickle reservoir that will keep that forest moist and not very likely to burn as long as that peak holds snow, because every day that it warms up in the spring and summer, moisture comes off that snowpack and keeps that forest wet. Well, we've got, less, I think about 2/3 of our normal snowpack here in Colorado. It's a terrible year for snowpack. And that means firefighters are looking at this season and thinking we're about to have a bad fire season. And in fact, it started this last weekend. We had 2 wildfires, I believe, on Saturday here on the Front Range with a lot of smoke in the air. So we had, fairly significant grass fires here on the Front Range of Colorado in early February.
So does that mean that the fire seasons, whether it be Colorado or any other state in the United States or around the world for that matter, does that mean fire seasons are effectively extending and that they're becoming more year-round or more multi-month than they ever have before?
Yeah, that's very well documented now. And so we're looking at about an 80-day increase to the length of the average fire season across the country or across the West. Fires in February here in Colorado are not uncommon anymore, but they used to be very uncommon. And in places in like California, they talk about it's a year-round fire season. So we saw California's really bad fire season started in summer when they usually don't have such bad fires. It's usually rainier. And it wasn't. And so their fire season started with very big destructive fires a good month, 6 weeks earlier than it normally does. And those fires, which normally are out by the holidays, by early December, burned right through January this year.
Do these fires have, as they're growing larger and more common, do they impact wildlife? Do they impact the ecosystem, or are they just fires and they naturally happen and everything kind of heals and gets on with it? Or because of their new size and their new proclivity to be larger, uh, is the impact different now? What's going on that spectrum of fires?
Yeah. So the answer to your question is yes. Um, so both are true. We've always had large fires that burned in remote wildernesses. And long before humans were interacting with these landscapes, we had fires that were probably much larger than we have now. But we also had not developed the landscape, built in thousands upon thousands of fire breaks with roads and dams and all the infrastructure, and we weren't spending billions of dollars putting them out. So if you think in terms of the fact that the United States still effectively puts out 98% of wildfires in this country on initial attack, so within a day, and we're seeing this steep an increase, that means that we're talking that steep increase is being driven by about 1% of the fires. So if you think in terms of if we just quit fighting all these fires and we didn't put out that other 98%, how fiery would our landscape be? And it would be very, very fiery. And so we have lots of landscapes that not only aren't damaged by these fires, they need it. They're fire dependent landscapes. The fires, like I described before, go through and thin out the forest a little bit. We have lots of species of animals that are dependent on wildfires. A great example is the black-backed woodpecker, which fell into steep decline when we were putting out so many fires, because it's dependent on what they call snag forests, which are our most severely burned forests, those forests where there's not a living tree in it and all you see are some burned stumps and half trees and things burned over. Well, the insects that move in there to feed and live in that burned landscape is the food source for the black-backed woodpecker. So it builds its nest nearby, and if you put out all those fires, it's going to run out of habitat. And there's many other examples of species that are really dependent on a regular fire regime. On the other end of that is we're also seeing fires that are burning not just much larger, which can totally change a forest, because what you do is when that fire is so big and the areas of what they call the fire mosaic, which is, every fire is made up of areas that are lightly burned and areas that are severely burned, and the balance of that range of severity of burning is called the fire mosaic. And as we've seen these bigger and more dangerous fires, we've also seen the area that's more severely burned in the fire mosaic grow. And if that area is so big that it removes what they call all of the obligate cedars, which are basically all the trees that would provide seed stock for the next generation to grow up in that burned landscape, you're not going to get those trees back because there's nothing to plant, there's nothing to provide the seeds.
So it can turn from, for lack of, I'm a layman here, for lack of better terms, it can turn from a healthy burn, which forests depend on, to almost an apocalyptic situation where everything is destroyed. And it's going to take, I would assume, generations for the land to be healthy and okay again?
It will take generations for it to turn back into what it was. Say it's a ponderosa pine forest. And we can see that from the Hayman fire, which was the largest fire in Colorado history prior to this last summer. And that fire's, 20, what is it? It was '02. So, not quite 20 years old. And if you go through a lot of the Hayman fire burn zone, you will not see new ponderosa pine trees growing up because the seeds are just gone. Or areas where you do see it, we've had to go in and plant them. And so it's kind of turned into this scrubby grassland. And a lot of that is not going to come back as a forest because there's no trees to father the new forest. Mm-hmm. So we're seeing a lot of landscape transformation by these fires. And so areas that were thick ponderosa pine forests are turning into more pinyon juniper, more arid landscapes, or scrub land, or Gampel oak forests that can survive the drier, hotter, more severe fire seasons.
So is that just Mother Nature? Is that just adaptation, or is it outside of the norm?
There's both. Some of it is, I mean, we've always seen forests transform and forests go through succession. So, you see a bad fire in a region, and then you'll see the aspens come in first and kind of colonize it, and then the evergreens will come in after that. But we're also seeing, because of the skewing of the severity of fires, and particularly the increase in large, and when we're talking large, we're talking 100,000 acre, 500,000 acre fires. The increase in the amount of severe burning and the size of these fires is largely human driven, and that's also transformative to a lot of these landscapes. So to give you a sense of the size issue with fires, prior to 1995, in the Forest Service record, which really only goes back to about the middle of the last century with any accuracy, the U.S. had about one megafire a year, and the Forest Service defines a megafire as any fire that is 100,000 acres or larger, which is not, as I write, is not what I think is the best gauge for what makes a fire mega. I mean, you can have a big fire in a remote wilderness that doesn't kill people and destroy homes. That's probably not that mega, and you can have a fire that's just a couple hundred acres that kills people or destroys homes. That's going to be real mega. So, but anyway, the U.S. Forest Service determines it by size, and it's 100,000 acres. And prior to 1995, we averaged one of those a year. That status this century has been closer to 10 of those a year. And we had well over 10 of those this last summer. And we also had last summer, the first time in the Forest Service record, the documentation of a gigafire. So a single wildfire in California that was more than 1 million acres.
That's an actual term, gigafire.
Well, as of the last 6 months. So we're seeing a lot more. It's not that we're seeing more fires overall. We actually are probably seeing a slight reduction in the number of fires recently, but we're seeing a lot more very big fires. Mm-hmm. So we're seeing, not really an increase in the number of fires, but a big increase in the acreage that's burning, because we're seeing so many of these big uncontainable fires.
In your book, you again, it was a book I could not put down. Great storytelling mixed with really good statistics of what is involved with battling fires, the size of fires, what creates fires, human experience. There are inspiring stories. There are somewhat depressing stories of dramatic consequence. Is there a story while you were writing this book that just stuck with you, that you still think about today?
Well, there are a lot of stories I still think about today. I mean, it was really as a lot of these books are, kind of a life-changing process for me. Megafire is a really good example of how not to write a book. I like to write books about topical things that are in the news and forget that, well, they're in the news because they're still happening and they're changing. And so I probably wrote 1,000 pages of Megafire to have a 350-page book, because every time I thought I was finished, something would happen. And I had, probably gone through 3 drafts of the book and was close to finishing when I was at a science writing retreat. Actually, I'd just gotten back in the country like a day before from covering fires in Europe. And while I was at this retreat up on the Niwot Ridge here, at the Mountain Research Station, a friend there handed me her phone because she still had service, and it said 19 hotshots dead in Arizona. And I just had to say, hey, I got to go. This is my beat. And got down to Arizona to Prescott the next day, and gradually pieced together what had occurred and what is the largest loss of life of professional wildland firefighters in the country's history. And all of these things that I'd written about, the forest management issue, the climate issue, and then one that we haven't talked about much, but that is a really big part of this, is the development issue that, we as Americans like to build houses in dangerous places. And so the Forest Service estimates that more than 30% of US homes now are in what we call the wildland urban interface, where they could be burned in a wildfire.
That's a tremendous percentage.
Yeah, you're talking 44 million homes that are at risk in this. And most of these people are unaware that they live in a place where they're at risk in wildfires. If you look at what happened in Colorado Springs, or what happened a couple of years ago in Santa Rosa, California, where homes burned in the middle of the city or well within the city limits. And what was spreading the fire was no longer a forest, but landscaping. The trees that burned were trees that people had planted there, cedar rail fences, deck, fire moving from deck to deck. And look at, what they call ember attacks, where, a forest is burning miles away, but with a 60-mile-an-hour wind behind it, it's like tens of thousands of bottle rockets and mortars are landing in neighborhoods that are miles inside of a city to ignite homes inside them. So, those people are not aware that their houses are at risk of burning in a wildfire, but they are. And anyway, when I went to Arizona to cover the Granite Mountain hotshots, and I ended up, it was the first of 10 or 11 trips that I made down there to read the reports, interview firefighters, interview family members, and try to wrap my head around what had happened there. I realized that all of these drivers I was talking about had all come to bear on this one firefighting crew. And and how one decision took them from a safety zone where they would most certainly have survived this exploding wildfire into an area that any firefighter with a day of training would have recognized as a death trap. And that the only reason they would do that was that they were trying to get to this community to protect homes in a state that is warming and drying faster than most anywhere in the contiguous United States, around forests that had fire suppressed so long that they were all badly overgrown and really difficult for firefighters to move through. And so it was, I write a lot of science in this book, and that's one of the things I really like doing, is taking the narrative, the human experience, and using that to draw people into let's understand how this happened. And in the case of the Granite Mountain hotshots, all of this science that I'd been researching for years and writing about for years suddenly had this very tragic human face on it.
So you've written about Mount Everest, high crimes. You've written about wildfires with Megafire. You have this extraordinary track record of environmental journalism. And yet you grew up in Kansas City, Missouri. I grew up in St. Louis. We're both Midwesterners. What was it about your life journey that brought you to caring about adventure, wild places, the great outdoors? Is there anything that sticks with you as to why you became kind of who you are?
Yeah, some of it was probably Boy Scouts. I spent a long time in Boy Scouts in a troop that, just was religious about going on a camping trip every month, regardless of weather. We got very wet and very cold really regularly. Some of it was probably that my younger brother was like the most gifted athlete in my family and could kick my butt at any ball sport by the time he was like 3 or 4 years old. And so I had to go into the woods and start rock climbing or skiing or something to find something that I could excel at and not have him taunting me.
So how do you go from that to really, in a way, turning it into your life's passion and livelihood?
So, and I worked in newspapers as just a workaday photojournalist for 25 years. And I covered everything. I worked in the Oval Office. I, was the editor in charge of Super Bowl coverage once, since we just had a Super Bowl yesterday. I, was at the World Series. There's a variety. You do everything. But even back when I was in college and even before, I had a real interest in environmental issues because they were issues that I felt I could do something about, where information can make people behave differently. I've matured some to realize that it's not quite so simple, but nonetheless, from early stories I did about nukes, and my first overseas assignment or story that I pitched that I got sent on with U.S. Vietnam veterans going back to Vietnam to remove ordnance and minefields that they laid, to what I do now with wildfire. With how did we get ourselves into this mess, and what can we do to get out of it? That there are, I care a lot about the land. It's a visceral place. You can see sometimes what's wrong with it. Even as a kid, you can figure out that, hey, that guy who's, changing his oil and then dumping the oil in the sewer, that can't be good. There's got to be something that there's got to be, a bad result from that. And that seems to be a fairly simple problem to fix. How would we do that? So I just got really interested in those things. I also, throughout my career, realized that those were the things that got me outside, and more and more, journalism has moved. I mean, we used to complain about how much of the reporting was done over the phone. Well, now it's like done blogging, or you send an email out if you're actually doing any reporting at all. And I always felt that getting out of the office and having to go outside and see it for yourself is really, really important. I kind of see reporting as this three-legged stool of great interviews, the documents you can find and read to learn the facts about things, and then observation, seeing it for yourself. And in the modern journalism world, the funnest part of this, which is the observation, is the part that's gone away the most. There are so many people that just do all of their journalism staring at their laptop, and they never go outside. They never actually go and see the people that they're writing about and the way that they're being impacted. They never go and experience that. And in environmental journalism, it's much harder to do that. When it's, whenever we talked about, well, there's a big oil spill, it's like, okay, hey, I got to go see that. I'm going to go run out there with my cameras, and I'm going to talk to people and ask them about what happened. And I always enjoyed working like that.
Where do you go next? What's next for you?
Well, I now work with a lot of other journalists and edit their stories and their photos. Inside Climate News is just an amazing place to be working. There's about 20 of us. It's real veteran environmental journalists and investigative journalists. Inside Climate News, despite the title, which it certainly tells you what we're about, but it's not as classy sounding as the newspaper where I spent most of my career, the Hartford Courant. But they've been around for about 14 years now, and we're the first small independent, online only news organization to win a Pulitzer Prize. Mm-hmm. They won a second Pulitzer, or they were nominated for a second Pulitzer Prize in 2015. It's really it's the largest and probably the most honored climate-focused newsroom in the country. So that's been great. And the job that I've got there is, it's a tricky balancing act, but I'm editing and overseeing reporters, particularly on climate science and Western issues. I am overseeing photo and video for the outfit. And then there's a portion of my time that is doing my own stories and working on projects with them. So I actually just had a story run this morning that I shot. I actually got to go out and make pictures about a week ago because it was in my backyard. And
I should mention, you talked a little bit about this photograph of the prisoner running from the flames, which, by the way, is outstanding. If nothing else, your book has incredible photographs, but you're a very talented photographer as well as writer. And so was it fun to get out and shoot again?
It was. I really wasn't sure if I remembered how to talk to somebody, face to face or mask to mask anymore. But no, it was a blast, and it's a really interesting story. This was actually a story that Nick Kuznets, who is our oil and gas reporter, he's based in New York, and he'd been researching this for a while to find an engineer at ExxonMobil who had left the company because he did not feel the company was doing enough about climate change. And there's a pretty large population of engineers, people at major oil companies that have been leaving because they've become disillusioned in the big oil industry's lack of progress towards the energy transition and
So
transitioning to green energy.
you're not talking about small business here. You're talking about ExxonMobil. Like, so Inside Climate News deals with big issues.
If you know, and I'm sure some of your listeners know, there's a campaign called Exxon New. And this is a campaign to basically a name and shame campaign against ExxonMobil, because documents from ExxonMobil show that the company knew back in the 1970s that the product they sold was going to have devastating impacts on the climate. And many of ExxonMobil's own scientists said, we have to stop. We have to move away from a fossil fuel driven economy, or there will be huge environmental consequences. That is all based on Inside Climate News' reporting. We got those documents and broke all those stories, and that's the project that it was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize for in 2015.
That's
So,
huge. That's
yeah.
huge.
So when I talk about the reporters I work with being basically at the top of the investigative journalism game in environmental issues, they really do. They have the street creds across the board.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, it was kind of more of a feature where Nick profiled this one engineer who had left ExxonMobil and has struggled for it and suffered for it, but he moved to this net zero fossil fuel community in Arvada, Colorado, just down the road from you and me. And so when Nick was talking about this story, it's like, that's a half hour from me. We don't need to hire a photographer. Give me an afternoon, guys, and I'll go shoot this. It'll be fun. And it was a blast, really interesting community where, the houses are 7 times tighter in their construction than the average American home. It's all geothermal heat pumps to heat and cool the homes. They actually have controllers that can control the amount of CO2 and volatile organic compounds in the air inside their units. And then other low tech things they do, like their weed control is a herd of 5 goats that they move from area to area, so they don't use any fossil fuels to control vegetation. So it was really fun to hear this guy's story for an afternoon and go about and see this community and how they live there, and make some photographs of him. And you can see that on Inside Climate News today or in the future. And I'll mention that Inside Climate News is free. You see our content in lots of other publications, everywhere from NBC News to High Country News to Newsweek and places like that. But you can go to our website and read any of our coverage for free whenever you'd like. We, of course, would love a donation. Particularly if you earmark it for me. But
right. In fact, the last time you and I saw each other, you were working like 24 hours straight on a deadline in cooperation with NBC News. So you do some cool stuff.
And that was a project that I'd hoped to photograph, and we had to bail out of it because the place I needed to go to make these photographs, people have there's a horrible number of people in this town that have lung diseases not related to COVID, but it's made the community much more vulnerable to COVID. And so, I decided that I wouldn't go there and make photographs for this story. But that was a really interesting project that, we're kind of in stage 3 or 4 of now, but basically looking at the climate impacts on Superfund sites, which are our most toxic sites in the United States. Get this designation from the EPA of Superfund, which is basically how they are going to get the industry that made the mess or the federal taxpayer, very often pay to clean this up and mitigate it. And in the case of Libby, Montana, the Superfund site is a forest that is filled with one of the deadliest known asbestoses. And has literally thousands of tons of this asbestos that was put all over this forest from a mine that operated in the area for about 70, 80 years. And it's already that asbestos just through other means, moving into the nearby town of Libby, Montana, has led to the deaths of more than 400 people from asbestos-related lung diseases. And there's a great fear that if a megafire was to move into that forest where all of this asbestos has accumulated, that it could just send a toxic plume of smoke or ash into nearby communities.
So, as someone who has inside knowledge, who has seen so much good, bad, and ugly of environmental issues, do you find yourself optimistic, pessimistic? What do you think our future for the human race and for the world that surrounds us and in which we're very much a part of? What do you think the future holds?
As a journalist focused on climate change and environmental issues, I'm optimistic that I will have lots of work for a very long time. As for our future, you've been around me. I'm kind of a natural pessimist. That's just the nature of journalism. What I'm optimistic about is that there does seem to be traction now. There does seem to be change afoot, and real impacts. The energy transition now is, this is something that's really happening and that people are serious about. It's not like a novelty or this cute little thing that people want to get solar panels on their roofs. There's a real recognition that we are going to have to transform how we electrify our communities, how we travel, all kinds of things. It's hard for me to, if I step back and I just look at the big picture of everything that crosses my plate and every story I edit during a day and everything that I read up on, it's hard to be optimistic. Back when I was at the Center for Environmental Journalism at the University of Colorado, I had friends there that just joked about, well, how do you guys get up out of bed every day? Because every day you bring in a speaker or some other thing, and it's always some horrible poisoning or some horrible thing that's happening to the atmosphere or some species that's being driven to extinction by human activity. A lot of suffering, and it can be really overwhelming. But for my part, for my own work, I usually just try to focus on the story that's at hand and try to have an attitude that, this information, if we package it right and get people to pay attention to it, has the potential to make some small improvement. That, we're giving the world the informational tools to make better decisions about what we do with our land, air, and water, and the species that we have to share this planet with. So despite my dark side, which you've certainly seen, particularly when there's enough whiskey involved, that there's an optimistic side to that too. That the work, that there is a feeling of fulfillment in the work, and that these are important stories to tell, and that I've kind of decided I just want to be a happy warrior about this. Okay, so it's likely that we're going to lose a lot of these battles, but if you're just down about it all the time, it's pretty hard to move forward and think, I'm going to go out there and take some more pictures and tell another story about this, even though I know it's not going to make a difference. You kind of have to convince yourself that there's a potential for change.
Interesting. Where can people find out more about Megafire? Where can they find out more about Inside Climate News? Where can we direct our listeners and viewers?
Well, you can go to my website, michaelkodas.com, which is in the middle of a desperately needed update. But you can certainly find out about Megafire there. There's also megafirebook.com where you can go to read a sample of it and order it. There are a few excerpts that you can find online that places have published, both of it and of High Crimes. And so, you can find my books at my website, insideclimatenews.org. And we have, new cutting edge climate investigations and climate focused journalism every day. We publish 7 days a week, just like our good old newspapers used to. We have, we focus on investigative journalism and fact-based science journalism. And, the stories are generally good. This is not the kind of science and climate coverage that is going to glaze over your eyes, and that you need a chemistry degree to understand or find interesting. The stories are well reported and well written, and written for the average person in mind.
Excellent. Well, Mr. Kodas, I look forward to our next bourbon. And
we're overdue for some whiskey.
Overdue. And thanks for just talking. It's been a fun conversation. I'll catch you soon. Thanks.
You will. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. See ya.
See you, man.